Daniel Franklin. Good luck. Thank you.
Well, hello, and it is a huge privilege each year to edit this publication, The World in 2015. What could be more fun than getting a bunch of very clever people and saying, what do you think is going to happen in the future? It's also a huge hostage to fortune, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt when you're looking ahead. The one thing we do know, most important thing that's happening next year, as you know, 2015 was the year they traveled forward to in Back to the Future 2. So October the 21st is the date that you all have to watch out for. What I'm going to do is just give you run through a few of the themes that struck me as particularly interesting in editing this year's publication. And I'll just start with the economy because from The Economist we have to do this. The good news is that actually the prospects for 2015 are pretty good from the point of view of the overall economy. It's not what you would necessarily think when you pick up the papers, but actually from the global economic perspective, the likelihood is that growth in the year ahead is going to be somewhat faster than in this year, 2014. So perhaps something like 3.8% growth, pretty good on a historical comparison compared with just over 3% this year. So that's the good news. But as you can see from this chart, it's very varied around the world. Emerging Asia, by far the most rapidly growing part of the world. North America doing pretty well, but Europe very sluggish, Japan sluggish. And that behind that lies, I think, what will be one of the central economic stories in the year ahead. You've got the United States, where growth is fairly vigorous. You just had a very, very good jobs report from America. You can see the unemployment numbers coming right down. And all the talk is going to be in the United States and followed by Britain too, of interest rates rising, an end to this extraordinary period of monetary looseness that we've seen. Whereas, and this is unusual for recent years, the Europeans and the Japanese are going to be moving in absolutely the opposite direction, piling on the stimulus in an effort to avoid deflation and potential recession. And that tension between America moving in one direction and Britain probably moving in that direction, European Central Bank and Japan in the other, will, I think, make for quite a lot of volatility. So I think that's the overall picture. You're going to have overall better growth, but a lot of volatility on the way with potential scary moments when equity markets are going to be in mini panics, problems for emerging markets as the dollar strengthens and as money is sucked back to America. You might well see dollar-euro parity in the year ahead. That's one of the forecasts that we have in this year's edition. And so currency markets, bond markets, all of those having quite a volatile ride. What I want to do for the next 10 minutes or so is run through some of the statistical landmarks of the year ahead. And we looked at a number of these, and it's fascinating to see crossover points, if you like, that are happening in 2015, which really say a lot about the way the world is changing. So I'm going to run through, as I say, nearly a dozen of these. Here's the first one. The United States overtaking Saudi Arabia to become the world's biggest oil producer next year. And that's a very important and interesting moment behind which lies a lot of other stories. Very important for geopolitics, obviously, to have the newly muscular United States in energy terms. It is changing its attitudes towards the Middle East. It's making for a lot of new thinking or rethinking in OPEC countries. And of course, the economic impact of this is dramatic. First of all, within America itself, it means America is becoming hyper-competitive in fuel-intensive industries again. So a lot of investment is coming back to American industries which they thought they'd lost. It's coming back because there's cheap energy available there. but also the impact on the oil price. And that's one of the biggest changes in recent times. 40% cut in the oil price is partly driven by the supply boost from the extraordinary change in American shale gas and oil production. So behind this story here is something that could affect even the geopolitics of the Middle East, the South America, big impact on a country like Venezuela, which is oil dependent and in deep budgetary trouble. You could well see a Venezuelan default in 2015. And of course, Russia hugely oil dependent, and the impact of the oil price change is probably bigger for Russia than anything to do with economic sanctions. So big problems behind this for Vladimir Putin and the Russian economy. Here's another. This is completely fascinating. This requires a bit of explanation. This is someone called Danny Quare at the LSE does a calculation of the economic center of gravity in the world and how it's changing over time. And he goes back to 1980 and forward to 2050. So it so happens that 2015 is the midpoint in that time period that he looks at. And you can see what's happening. So the period that he begins to look at, 1980, the center of the world's economic gravity is somewhere in the middle of mid-Atlantic. And it's shifting way over so that by 2050, it'll be somewhere between China and India. So if you look at nothing else, no other picture or chart, this tells you most of what you need to know about the broad sweep of the way that the world is changing in economic terms. In 2015, it's going to be the center of gravity happens to fall somewhere around a city in Iran. But I think that's an absolutely fascinating glimpse of how the economy is changing in this period. Here's another huge change, and one that affects probably many of you in your work. This is a picture of Chinese foreign direct investment, both inflows and outflows. And you're very familiar with the idea that China has been hugely hungry for foreign investment. It's been a giant destination for foreign capital. And many companies have flocked to invest in China. And it's still hungry for that capital. It's not as if inflows of foreign direct investment into China are about to collapse. But what's completely striking is how rapidly Chinese outflows of foreign direct investment, Chinese investment outside its own country, is just zooming up. And in 2015, will actually probably outstrip inflows for the first time. So what that means is that Chinese companies, state-owned and increasingly private companies as well, are moving out, buying market share, buying brands, buying know-how, and really coming increasingly to be engaged in the world in a way that hasn't really happened before. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest trends in business that will impact, and they will need help. They will need expertise, and they're looking increasingly to become more and more sophisticated through this investment. So I think that's a very big trend for everybody in this room as well. Here's another Chinese one, Chinese takeover. China becoming, probably as we speak, so probably beginning 2015, as for the first time, at least in centuries, the world's biggest economy. It's overtaking the United States, at least by one important measure of economic size, which is when you measure it at purchasing power parity. There are other ways of measuring the size of an economy. You can do it at current exchange rate, but this is one of the important ones. And by this measure, China is becoming number one. And that's something that is, I think, first of all, an extremely mind-concentrating moment, particularly for Americans. Americans are used to being number one. They still are number one in all sorts of number one military power. They're still much richer than Chinese, although it has to be said that Asian high net worth individuals, by one forecast next year, will have as much money as North American high net worth individuals. So it's not just a question of mass numbers. Asia is becoming richer as well as bigger economically. So very important for mind concentrating for America to think of this graphical illustration of China's emergence. But also for China itself. China tends to downplay this. It doesn't make a great song and dance about it because it's suited China to rise somewhat below the radar screen. Next one, and it's related to this, is a military spending crossover with Asia-Pacific countries, this time excluding China, outspending for the first time EU in terms of defense spending. And that's, again, a reflection of China's rise, because Asian economies, Asian countries are starting to spend more and more on defense because they're worried about the emerging giant next door, China. China itself, by the way, next year for the first time will be spending more than France, Britain, and Germany combined in terms of defense spending. Here's a tech transition that will be familiar to all of you. You're all contributing to this, I'm sure. Sales of tablets and hybrids outnumbering for the first time desktops and laptop PCs. So I'm sure pretty much everybody in this room is part of this great global trend. What's fascinating is just how fast that happened. Just a few years ago, tablets barely existed as a category, and all of a sudden, there they are, outstripping desktops. Again, something highly relevant to this room and slightly sobering if you work for a weekly, historically print newspaper. These are not global figures, these are US figures, but of course it points to the trend that is happening globally too, and that's that spending on internet advertising is, according to this estimate anyway, about to overtake that on newspapers, magazines, and outdoor. So rest assured, The Economist has all sorts of cunning plans to deal with this very successfully in its business. Here's one that sort of defies common sense and the imagination. Next year, mobile phone subscriptions will outnumber the number of people on the planet. So, how is this possible, you might wonder? Well, of course, a lot of people have more than one mobile subscription for sort of good reasons and not so good reasons sometimes. But we've been hearing so much today about the importance of mobile, and there you can see one reason why. And another thing you've been hearing a lot about, social media. If Facebook were a country, and here called Facebook land, pretty soon it's going to be the biggest in the world, outnumbering China. So more people on Facebook than there are people in China. That's all the more remarkable when you think that Facebook isn't really permitted in China. So it's a particularly amazing statistic. Here's a slightly change of tack. Royalty. If Queen Elizabeth stays healthy and doesn't abdicate, she will overtake next year Victoria to become the longest reigning English monarch ever. And then finally, this is one that also requires a bit of explanation, but it's a particularly fascinating one. This shows the population of the world by age increments. So the bottom bar there, male on the right, female male on the left, sorry, female on the right, is 0 to 5, and then you have 6 to 10, and so on upwards. And historically, if you go back to 1970, we have what you've always known as the population pyramid. I'm sure you went to school and learnt about the population pyramid, which told you that the largest number of people were at the bottom, and then there was the next largest number, and so on up till you get people dying off, and the pyramid ends in a peak. Well, that is now changing, and if you look at where we will be in 2015, that was the picture back in 1970. It's been gradually changing by 2015 because people basically, their fertility rate has dropped dramatically. The bottom rungs are no longer so staggered, and the shape is now much more, not like something you would find on the Nile, but much more like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The pyramid has become a dome. and people at the very top are living longer, so the dome even has a bit of a spire. And then if you fast forward the equivalent number of years into the future, even the dome is changing shape again. You've got most of these age segments being more or less equally measured until you get to the very top where people are starting to die off at different ages. But the dome has become a pillar. So over this nearly century period, the shape of the world literally has changed dramatically from pyramid to pillar, with huge implications for public policy, for how we're going to pay for pensions, for where the workforce is going to come to, and of course, who you're getting marketing messages out to. So I think behind that picture lies all sorts of implications for everybody's working lives. Now, this final 5 minutes of my presentation, I'm just going to give you a sneak preview of a few of the sorts of covers you may see in The Economist in the year ahead. These are not real covers, I hasten to add. These are covers that our brilliant cover designer has done around themes for the world in. So here's one, The Coming Wage Shock, Why Global Wages Will Rise. And the thinking behind this is that actually one of the stories, big stories of recent years has been the growing inequality and the fact that the spoils of growth haven't been evenly distributed. Wages have fallen behind. Next year, this may start to change for a number of reasons. Already wage costs rising quite dramatically in China, so the China cost is growing up. Unemployment has come way down in the United States. You're starting to see the beginnings of wage pressure building up again there, and you'll probably see the same thing happening here in this country with a lag. And you have a public policy reaction too, things like minimum wages, living wages, pressure to put wages up as well. So next year may be the first time in many years when the big bosses of multinational companies start to worry not just about the bad headlines their own jumbo salaries are creating, but the headlines about the growing costs of their labor force. Here's one which is, I think, is a completely lovely cover. Please don't send this too far away, because we'd like to use it perhaps one day in The Economist. This is the company you may be hearing a lot more about next year, a company called Xiaomi, Chinese mobile phone company, which is, has striking resemblances, striking similarities to Apple. So you can see the logo there. Its founder does presentations in sort of black turtleneck and jeans, similar to you-know-who. Just 4 years old, already the biggest mobile phone maker in China, and it's going global. So that's the story. It's going to be, Xiaomi is going to be something you hear more about. Maybe not as Xiaomi, because that's difficult for Americans to pronounce. Americans, after all, still think of Huawei often as Hawaii. But maybe just as Mi. So if you look at the domain name Mi, Xiaomi has taken it. It won't be easy for them. They're going to come face to face with the armies of lawyers from Apple and Samsung and so on. But watch out for them. Another potential cover, the rise of wearable technology. We've been hearing, Tara was just talking about it, we've heard a few other people mentioning it. You can see here all sorts of things, the watch, the shoes, everything containing data. And it's the marriage of the data and the physical that we're really talking about here. Really a great shift in prospect in Silicon Valley, where what will be fashionable will be this design and usability, as well as what has been fashionable in recent years. It's all been about social networks. So watch out for, in a way, Silicon Valley returning to its roots of making physical things as well, a new age for Silicon Valley. Talking cars that communicate. If you can't read what it's just said, one car is saying, "I've just passed the mother of all potholes." Another is saying back, "Thank you, we'll take avoiding action. P.S. Tell your driver there are speed cameras in 2 miles." So the idea is this is big data everywhere. Cars are increasingly connected to those data and will increasingly be providing information to drivers. Not quite yet the driverless future, which is being experimented with, of course, in various ways too. but approaching it anyway. And then finally, this cover, the Middle Kingdom meets the Magic Kingdom. At the end of next year, Disney is opening Disneyland in Shanghai, or due to. So that's what the image is showing there. And it's really behind that is the great story of the Chinese economy, still probably growing at 7%, slowing, as you know, but 7% is no mean growth rate, but changing very much the rise of Chinese services, the great mass of Chinese consumers wanting things like Disneyland, wanting enhanced services, and having money to pay for it. So that's going to be a big driver of the economy in the year ahead. So that's a sort of sneak preview of the sort of economic stories we have. Just one final image to leave you with. I think two of the great events in the year ahead that we know will be happening and we'll have a lot of conversation around them really pretty much throughout the year are the two bits of global diplomacy, one around Millennium Development Goals, or replacements for the Millennium Development Goals, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. That's at the UN in September. And then secondly, the climate change talks that will be culminating in Paris at the end of the year. Those are the big bits of global diplomacy. The image here questions whether the rise of nationalism and other sort of argumentative nature of the world will allow us to reach agreement on that. But I think the important point that I would stress to you is that particularly the Millennium Development Goals, this is not just a top-down process. This time round, it's very much a bottom-up process with a sense that very large numbers of people around the world are going to be involved in this conversation. This is a message that I think is something that everyone has the potential to be, or a debate that everyone has the potential to be involved in, and that's something that you might all want to be aware of. So that's it. A few thoughts for the year ahead. I would just finish by wishing you all the very best for 2015. Thank you.